It's a night, it's a day which is supposed to shake us to our core, and I will try to the best of my ability to take us into this shaking day. But before I do so, I want to share with you a story that hopefully will mellow just slightly what I'm going to say later. My Rabbi and Zaidi Alem Shalom, I'd like to tell you about the story about how they came to move from the US to Israel. And as far as I'm concerned, the story starts in 1947, when my great-grandfather, Yitzchak Feigenbaum, in 1947, he wrote a moral will, something which was very common, maybe still is today, but used to be very common. And in his moral will, which he wrote in 1947, it spans 4 pages. It touches upon all the different messages that he wanted to make sure that his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren remembered about him, about what was important to him, about Judaism, about Torah, about Menschlichkeit. And in his moral will, 5 different times, 5 different places, he mentions how important it is to him that his children and grandchildren remember that they need to support Eretz Yisrael, they need to be involved with Eretz Yisrael, they need to try to move to Eretz Yisrael 5 different times in his moral will, more so than any other point. He mentions Shabbos 4 times, he mentions singing at the Shabbos table 3 times, he mentions Sukkah, he mentions Lulav, he mentions a whole bunch of things. 5 times he mentioned this. And the message seeped deep to my great-grandfather's children, among them my Zaidi Alav Shalom. And that's why he raised his 4 children, among them my mother. And I remember hearing stories that my mother would tell me. She remembers when she was a child, her father would take his 4 children, my mother and her 3 siblings, by the hand on Shabbos to shul, and then sit down with the other kids and run a program to teach them about Eretz Yisrael. I know I've met few people in my life who had a deeper passion and love to Eretz Yisrael than my Zaidi. And that's why he raised his children. And my mother, true to her father's education, when she finished high school, she decided to go to Israel and Hachshara, which is back in the day was a very popular thing. She went to kibbutz for a year, volunteered in the kibbutz, spent mornings working in the kibbutz, afternoons learning, hearing shiurim. And on kibbutz, she met my father. My mother was from Cleveland. My father was from New York. They met on kibbutz. They fell in love. And after the end of the year, they went back to the States, got married with a plan to make aliyah, to join kibbutz. That's what they were taught to do. But before doing so, my Rabbi and my Zaidi told my parents, wait for us for 2 years. We're very proud of you. We're very supportive. Give us 2 years, we'll wrap up the business, we'll sell our house, we'll get everything in order, and we'll come with you. My parents, they were newlyweds, they were 19 years old, they said, a lot easier to go with your parents than to go alone. They said, fine, we'll wait for 2 years. After 2 years, my parents were ready to go again. My grandparents said, it wasn't the right time to sell the business, to sell the house. 2 more years and we'll come with you. I have no doubt in my mind that they meant it. As I've said before, I've met fewer people in my life that were more passionate and more sincere about their love for Eretz Yisrael and Medinat Yisrael. My parents said, doesn't go, we're going. We can't wait any longer. We were taught to go, we're going. My parents made aliyah to kibbutz. My grandparents stayed in the States. After 4 months, it was quite difficult. Things did not work out. A story for a different time. My parents came back to the States, and they had nothing. They didn't have an education because they didn't need education. They were going to kibbutz. They didn't have any possessions. They didn't have any possessions. They were going to be on kibbutz. So they had no choice. They moved back with my grandparents for a year. 10 years later, they accumulated enough money. They made aliyah again. They moved to Efrat, which is where I grew up. My grandparents, when my parents came back the second time, my parents said to my grandparents, okay, we're going, let's go. At the time, I mentioned that my grandparents had four children. So at the time, one of my mother's siblings already also went in Hachshara, remained after Hachshara and went to Hebrew U and learned in Hebrew U. So at this point, my grandparents had 2 children in Israel and 2 children still in Cleveland, Ohio, in the States. So my grandparents said, it's now 2 and 2. Once the majority of our children are in Israel, we will come. I have no doubt in my mind they meant it 100%. I really don't. I'm not being cynical. A few years later, their third child, the third of their children, made Aliyah as well, and my grandparents were going to come. A few months after the third child made Aliyah, the remaining child, my uncle, who was their oldest, was diagnosed with leukemia. So they obviously, even though they had started to prepare to come to Israel, they obviously were not going to leave. It was a very trying year and a half. After a year and a half, my uncle passed away. By that time, my grandparents had depleted all of their savings, helping with the treatment, helping the family. He wasn't able to work. And within a year and a half after he passed away, they had to declare bankruptcy. They sold their business. They declared bankruptcy. They had sold the house. And if it were not true, it would almost be funny. That same winter, there was a pretty serious winter. Their house, their basement flooded, and lightning struck their porch, and it exploded. At this point, even if they had wanted to stay, they couldn't. They were forced. They had no other option. They came to Israel, moved to Efrat, where their three remaining children lived. They moved on the same block as all the grandchildren in Israel. Half a year after they made Aliyah, my grandfather had a stroke. He continued living for another year and a half, and he never went back to being exactly the same, but he was okay. And then my grandmother continued living on for almost 10 years more. Lived the last 8 years of her life, surrounded by her children and her grandchildren, those remaining from her children and many of her grandchildren. And it's a bittersweet story because it almost didn't happen. They came this close, even though it ran to the core of what they believed in. So I tell this story because I know how difficult what I'm going to say is going to be in a minute. But I say because I know that it's not easy what I'm about to say, and I know it's not as easy as I'm going to make it sound. So up to this point is my apology. And now, tomorrow in Mincha, we will be reading the Tefillah of Nachem. After Chatzot of Tisha B'Av, the mourning, the severity of the Avelut, the severity of the mourning is decreased. And the halacha, this is reflected in the halachot as well. You no longer need to sit on the floor on a low stool. And there's several other halachot that after Chatzot, after midday tomorrow, the severity of the mourning goes down. And that is why during Mincha, we say the Tefillah of Nachem. The Tefillah of Nachem means to be consoled. So from Chatzot of tomorrow, midday, it's kind of mixed, because while we are still mourning for the destruction of Bet HaMikdash and the Jewish people being sent into exile, we are beginning to think about how do we become consoled. And in Nachem we say the following sentence. We ask Hashem, say, "Oh Hashem, our God, console the mourners of Zion and the mourners of Jerusalem." We ask Hashem to begin giving us some kind of consolation. And we go on to say, we ask Hashem to console the city of Yerushalayim, which is mournful. And then the Tefillah goes on to describe the city of Yerushalayim. And it says the following thing. So we ask Hashem to console the city that is mournful, ruined, scorned, desolate. And it goes on to elaborate that the city of Yerushalayim is mournful without her children, ruined without her abodes, scorned without her glory. And listen to this. And it describes the city of Yerushalayim as desolate without inhabitants. Shomema me'ein yoshev. We are required by halacha, and that's what we'll do, to stand tomorrow before Hashem and ask Him to console Yerushalayim, describing Yerushalayim as desolate from its inhabitants. 100 years ago, there were approximately 60,000 Jews living in Israel. 100 years later today, 100 years later, there are approximately 6 million Jews, over 6 million Jews in Israel. In the last 100 years, the Jewish population in Eretz Israel has grown, you ready for this? By 10,000%. Never in the history of the Jewish people have there been as many Jews living in Yerushalayim as there are at this very moment. Never in the history of Am Yisrael have there been so many yeshiva students sitting in Israel and learning Torah. Never in the history of Am Yisrael. Not during the time of Yoshua bin Nun, not during the time of David HaMelech, not during the time of the Hashmonaim. Never in the history of Am Yisrael have there been as many Jews living in Yerushalayim as there are today. How are we going to stand here tomorrow during Mincha and say, Hashem console the city which is desolate from its inhabitants? How are we going to say those words? Are they just words? Do we not mean what we say? As our tefillah so and wrote that we just go and we say it, we don't pay attention to what we mean? Or do we make believe that nothing has changed? No. The fact that there are now 6 million Jews in Israel doesn't make a difference to me. Nothing. 200 years ago, we could be sitting on the floor in a shul, saying the same kinot, saying the same eicha, saying the same tefillot. Nothing has changed. Are they just words? Or are we in denial of the realities that are around us? The image I have in my mind when I think of this, and I apologize ahead of time, I will not offer you a good answer. I offer you hopefully a very troubling and harsh question. The image I have in my mind when I think of this, I think of a child who's being punished by his father, by his parents. He's not allowed to go out to play in the playground. And he's upset. I have young children, I deal with this all the time. And he's standing at the door and he's crying out to his father, his mother. Says, Abba, I want to go out to play. I want to go out to play. Please, I want to go out to play. And he's crying and he's throwing a tantrum. He's beating his hands and his feet on the floor. And his father stands by the door and he says, you can't go out, either because he's punished or because it's winter outside, whatever it is. And the kid is screaming and yelling and throwing a tantrum and not paying attention to anything around him. And his father is there barring the door, not allowing him in. And at some point, and another hour goes by, and another hour goes by, and at some point, the kid doesn't notice that the father has opened the door, and the father has walked outside and is standing in the playground, and the sun is shining, and the father is standing in the playground with his hands open, and he's smiling to his child, and he goes like this, signaling for him, come out to play, you can come, it's okay, it's safe, the winter has gone away, I've forgiven you, you can come back. And there are a lot of other children running around the playground. But the kid has his eyes closed. And he's still lying on the floor. We've all seen this with little kids. And his eyes are closed and he can't see the reality around him. He's beating and he's crying and he's yelling and he's screaming. If he were just to open his eyes, he would see that the playground is right there in front of him. He could just go outside and play. The father's there. He's letting you come. For 2,000 years, the door was closed. The door is open. So 200 years ago, we would be sitting on the floor and the only choice we would have is to cry and to say the words and to mean them. And we could mean them. 200 years ago, 150 years ago, we could sit on the ground and the only option we had was to cry and to read and to pray. We do all those things today also. But has nothing changed? I said at the beginning, this is a day of harsh truths. It's a day which is supposed to shake us to our core. It is a day which is supposed to signal to us that something in this reality around us is completely off. We live our lives 364 days in some kind of an illusion. It's been that way for the last 2,000 years. But definitely now. There's something in this entire picture of the way we live our lives here, which is an illusion. And it's very easy to buy into the illusion, especially in a place like Toronto, because it's so easy to be Jewish here. It's so easy. And it's so comfortable. 200 years ago, So of course we dreamt and we prayed because everything was around us was so horrible. But this is a day which is supposed to shake us to our core, to tell us something in this entire reality is off. It's like you're looking at a 3D picture, and then suddenly you get a glance that the whole picture is not what it looks like. That's what this day is about. So my question is a difficult one. When you stand tomorrow and say Nachem, and you say about the city of Yerushalayim that it is Shomemah Me'en Yoshev, it is desolate without inhabitants, stop and think. I'm not talking about halacha now. I'm talking about, you can be standing and davening, and that's the tefillah, and that's as it says it. Although I will tell you that there are places, especially in Israel, where some modifications have been made, but most kehilot do not do that, and should not do that, and I should ask the Rav. I'm not giving any kind of halachic psika here. But when you say those words tomorrow, and you know what? I'll say even more. When you say every day, 3 times a day in tefillah, Tkav v'shafar gadol lecharotenu, Hashem, blow a shofar and bring in the exiles. What are you thinking in that moment? Is it just words? Okay, but at least admit it. Let's not lie to ourselves. This is a day in which we can't lie to ourselves. There's one other day. This and Yom Kippur. There's a reason why they're so similar. There's a reason why the halachot are so similar. Yom Kippur is a day where you do tshuva as an individual, and you try to be true to yourself, not to lie, not to be fake. Tisha B'Av is the same. What will you be thinking tomorrow during Nechem? What will you be thinking every day when you ask Hashem to bring in the exiles? What are you asking from Him, and what is He asking from you? So, my 2, not answers, but maybe suggestions. And there are suggestions for me as well. 1, to admit it. It's not easy to admit that something about the way we lead our lives is fake. Admit it. What do you mean when you say those words? What should you be thinking when you say those words tomorrow? And the second is, what are you going to do about it? That's why I said, I know it's not easy. I am not saying now that the conclusion of what I'm saying is everyone needs to tomorrow book their flight to Israel. That'd be nice. But that's not my call to action. I'm not so naive. And I started off with the story of my grandparents because I know it's not easy. I'm not so naive to think that it's just a matter of, I really want it. My grandparents wanted it more than anyone I know. They barely made it. They just as easily could have not have made it. But it's not an all or nothing game. How are you going to educate your kids? Where are you going to decide to go when you go on vacation? How important is it to you to make sure your kids go to Israel after they finish high school? What activities are you going to make sure they're involved in? What activities are you going to be involved in the community? First off, admit that there's something which is completely off. And then figure out what are you going to do about it. What are the steps you're going to do to make sure that you don't continue living for the next 120 years in a state of denial, of fakery. As I said, a day of harsh truths, of harsh questions. May we use this day, as well as every day of our life, of our tefillot, to reflect. What are we true to? What is a bit off? And what are we going to do about it?